Welcome to Public Lectures at the American Philosophical Society. Tonight, co-hosted with our friends and neighbors at the Carpenters Company of Philadelphia. We wish we could gather in person, but staying well and in good health must continue to be a priority for us all. I have just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, we are delighted that this evening's program will be closed captioned. If you would find this service of help, please just click on the link you will find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Q&A. Dr. Norton is very much looking forward to your questions, and you may ask them at any time by going to the Q&A click also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Questions will be taken only through the Q&A link. And finally, it is my great privilege to invite all of you to attend via Zoom the keynote address at the Society's forthcoming members meeting. On Wednesday evening, November 11th, Lawrence Bobo, Dean of Social Sciences and the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of Social Sciences at Harvard University, will speak to A Failure to Heal, Race and Politics in the United States, a timely and important conversation. The Society is pleased to encourage wide participation. Registration is required, but you may do so easily by visiting the Society's website at www.amphilosoc.org. And now, I will turn the screen over to our good partner, Michael Norris, Executive Director of the Carpenters Company.
Thanks, Annie. As Annie said, I'm Michael Norris, the Executive Director of the Carpenters Company, and we're happy to co-host this event with our neighbors and friends at APS. Since 1774 is a pretty important year for us. The Carpenters Company was founded in 1724 as a trade guild for Philadelphia's master builders. The organization still exists today as a professional association for leading architects, builders, and engineers. In the early 1770s, the company built Carpenter's Hall, which you can see behind me, as its meeting space. And in the fall of 1774, we hosted the 56 delegates of the First Continental Congress, a meeting that's heavily discussed in Dr. Norton's book. The company has a deep and time-honored relationship with APS that dates back to the late 18th century, when APS housed its collection of scientific instruments in Carpenter's Hall. In more recent times, APS has housed our most precious archives and records in their storage vault, and we continue to pursue partnerships and collaborations with them, like tonight. I want to quickly plug two upcoming events we're doing. For those of you in Philadelphia, please come by Carpenter's Hall on Monday, October 26th at 4 o'clock, where we'll be hosting a free outdoor event commemorating the end of the First Continental Congress, where some special guests will read selections from some of the historic documents that were released by the delegates. And on Saturday, November 14th, we're presenting the inaugural David McCullough Prize for Excellence in American Public History to Lonnie Bunch, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. David and Lonnie are both APS members, and this is a free virtual event, so I hope you will join us. I'll put the registration links for both events in the chat in a minute. It's now my pleasure to turn things over to Robert Hauser, Executive Officer at APS.
Good evening. This is Bob Hauser, and I'm the Executive Officer of the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to this virtual public program carried out in collaboration with the Carpenters Company of the Society and its David Center for the American Revolution. I'm glad that you've joined us this evening. The American Philosophical Society acknowledges with respect that it resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationship with this land continues to this day. We recognize their continued presence and perseverance despite centuries of land theft, removal, and persecution of their language and cultural traditions. Throughout its history, the Society has benefited from its residents in this part of Lenape land, now called Philadelphia. We honor the Lenape community and those of other native peoples through our collections, fellowships, research awards, and outreach activities. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743 with the mission of promoting useful knowledge. Most of our nation's founders were members, and the APS had Thomas Jefferson as its president for 17 years, during most of which he was either vice president or president of the United States. Like the Constitution, the presidency, the Congress, and the courts, as a source and keeper of knowledge, the society was an essential piece of the bedrock on which our new nation was founded almost 250 years ago. It remains so today. While we at the Society continue to admire Franklin and Jefferson and other founding members for their key roles in the formation of our nation, for their leadership of the Society, and for their devotion to science, education, and other noble causes, we are also much aware of their faults, and most significantly, their slaveholding. We at the APS are committed to sustaining the better parts of their legacies while working toward a future of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, the APS IDEA, IDEA. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1 million of research grants and fellowships each year, primarily to the younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library, museum collections, and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. And the Society sustains an informed citizenry. We do that through our meetings, influencing the influencers, and other events like this one. Although our facilities remain physically closed to all but staff and fellows, we remain committed to serving our mission of promoting useful knowledge. Please check the events link on the APS website, both for our traditional offerings and for news of forthcoming virtual events, like the talk by Lawrence Bobo that Annie Westcott just mentioned. It is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Mary Beth Norton. She's the Mary Donlin Alger Professor of American History Emerita at Cornell University, where she taught from 1971 to 2018. In 2005-06, she was Pitt Professor of American History and Institutions at the University of Cambridge. She has written 6 books about early American history, including Liberty's Daughters, The Revolutionary Experience of American Women, 1750 to 1800, and In the Devil's Snare, The Salem Witchcraft Crisis of 1692. She was an author with others of A People and a Nation, which appeared in its 11th edition in 2018. It has been one of the leading U.S. history textbooks since its initial publication in 1982. Professor Norton has been elected a member both of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. She served as president of the 12,000-member American Historical Association in 2018. Her most recent work is 1774, The Long Year of Revolution, published by Alfred A. Knopf in February 2020, which is the subject of her talk this evening. Professor Norton's talk will be followed, as you've already heard, by Q&A moderated by APS librarian Patrick Spiro. Professor Norton, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Bob. So I'm happy to be here, even virtually, not actually physically in Philadelphia, because I always enjoy the meetings of the APS. And what I want to do to begin is to talk about why I wrote the book, 1774, The Long Year of Revolution, and what I wanted to accomplish in it. I wrote the book to describe political discourse among Americans in the key year of 1774. That's because the importance of the events of 1774 has commonly been overlooked, despite the fact that this period, what I call the long year, immediately precedes the outbreak of fighting in April 1775. I call it the long year because I start the discussion in the fall of 1773 and end it just before the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. Now, it seems a bit peculiar that the specific events of this year have long been overlooked in American scholarship and British scholarship too, for that matter. And that's because the way in which this period has been discussed has been that it's been written from the viewpoint of the revolutionaries. And if you write the history of this period from the viewpoint of those who led the revolution ultimately, what happens in 1774 seems of a piece with what started in 1765 with the Stamp Act crisis and continued with the Townsend Duties crisis in 1768 to 1769. And there's nothing seems to be special about 1774. But it was my dissertation on the Loyalists long ago in the late 60s that made me realize how important the events of 1774 were. I realized that the men I was studying, and they were mostly men, although some of them were women, really were politically energized by the events of 1774. I won't say they became loyalists because they were loyalists. They remained loyalists. And this led me to the belief that the events of the year 1774 were absolutely key in the coming of the revolution. I just want everyone to think about it for a moment. In 1773, Americans almost to a person were loyal to King George III and the empire. It's really hard. I think you would have to look very hard to find someone in 1773 who was advocating independence or separation from the empire in any way. Not even people like John and Samuel Adams differed with that opinion. They gloried in their identity as Anglo-Americans and as parts of the British Empire. By late 1774, early 1775, however, as I found in my research for this book, that had all changed. I actually knew that in advance, but I was able to cement that with my research for the book. Colonial governors, by the end of 1774, were writing uniformly to Britain, to Lord Dartmouth, the American secretary, to say that the people would not obey them, that Americans instead called the resolutions of the Continental Congress their laws, which the governors thought was terrible. And so the governors uniformly told Lord Dartmouth that they had decided that it was best for them not even to try to enforce obedience to the king, because it would show their impotence. They could not get the colonists to obey them, so they decided just to try, not to even try. Other Americans also wrote to Britain that winter, expressing the belief that there would be war in the spring, and there was, as we all know. Now, the book is about political discourse. What do I mean by that? I mean the writings in newspapers, pamphlets, and correspondence from this period. I actually read every political pamphlet published in America between the fall of 1773 and April of 1775. What I wanted to do in the book was to recapture the events of this period as they happened. So the book is organized chronologically. Most books on this period, if they deal with it at all, they don't discuss things chronologically. It's also discussed geographically. When events in 1774 have been discussed in any detail in other books, they have concentrated almost exclusively on Boston and Massachusetts, with very little attention paid to what's going on in the other colonies. Maybe a bit about what happens in Philadelphia during the First Continental Congress in September and October of 1774, but not with much attention being paid to places like New York City, where there were huge debates, really broadside wars that were fought out sometimes physically, in the streets of New York City, and in Georgia, which turned out to be especially interesting. For that colony, along with New York City, had many people who did not agree with the trend of resistance in 1774. Now, although the book has plenty of action, including descriptions of large groups of men throwing tea overboard in various cities and towns, not just in Boston, which is the incident everyone knows about, or even groups in late 1774 attacking forts in New England to take control of cannons, muskets, and ammunition that were stored in the forts. This book is mostly about talk. It's a book about Americans discussing with each other in print what should be done as the crisis deepened and the year progressed, and sometimes in correspondence too, but mostly in print. I wanted to give voice to all the participants in the multifaceted dialogues of that year, and to show moderate and conservative positions as well as radical ones. Regardless of where the people ended up, regardless of whether the people I was writing about ended up as loyalists or revolutionaries or somewhere in the middle, and there were plenty of people who were somewhere in the middle, I wanted to show Americans today the number of debates that happened in 1774, which we rarely hear about today. And I wanted, if I did it right, I want readers to forget that they know what happened, that they know how the story came out, because I wanted to give immediacy and contingency to the discussions. I wanted us to be in the middle, that is, contemporary readers today, to be in the middle of the arguments that Americans in the past were having. I'll just make a contemporary reference here. I think that Americans today tend to think that everybody in the 18th century, or at least most people in the Revolutionary period, agreed with each other. They didn't. It's just like today. America was very divided over what to do as they confronted this particular crisis. Now, there were many disagreements that developed during the year 1774, and I don't have time this evening, obviously, to discuss the whole book. So let me just give you 4 examples that are usually not discussed in books on the coming of the revolution. The first argument was what was the best way to oppose the tea that was being sent to North America by the East India Company. Now, the first thing I have to explain briefly is, why did people want to oppose the East India Company tea in the first place? The reason was not because of higher taxes on it. The image that we have today of the Boston Tea Party is that people threw the tea into the Boston Harbor because they were protesting higher taxes. They were not protesting higher taxes. In fact, counterintuitively, they were protesting a lower tax, because what Britain had done was to lower the tax on tea in order to try to make East India Company tea, that is legal tea, tea that was legally imported into the colonies from China, to make it competitive with smuggled tea, which was smuggled in basically through the Dutch islands in the Caribbean, also through other places, but which was largely known as Dutch tea in the colonies. And one of the things we know from the people who have studied the tea trade is that Americans drank prodigious amounts of tea in the 18th century, and most of it was smuggled tea. So the East India Company was losing out on a lot of potential revenue. So the idea behind the Tea Act, which was adopted in England in 1773 in May, was to try to lower the price of tea in North America so that Americans would, in fact, prefer to buy legal tea rather than buying smuggled tea. What Americans were complaining about was not the amount of the tax, but the symbolism of the tax. What they were complaining about in the various tea parties and various protests that we see talked about in 1774 was the fact that the tax had been imposed by Parliament and not by their own legislatures. That's what they meant by no taxation without representation. Not that they wanted representation in Parliament because they knew that any colonist would be outvoted, but because they wanted to be taxed only by their own legislative bodies. So what were the different ideas that Americans put forward about opposing the tea when they found out it was coming? And I should say that they found out in October of 1773 that 7 tea ships were on their way to North America with East India Company tea. One idea was to try to force the consignees of that tea to resign their positions. The consignees were the merchants who were specifically designated to receive the tea. The argument was that if you force the consignees to resign their commissions, then no one would be available to receive the tea, and the tea could therefore not be sold. So that was one argument, and that was put forward in an essay in Philadelphia. A essayist in New York proposed instead a consumer boycott of tea. He said, why don't we just, it doesn't matter whether the tea lands or not, we all just have to agree not to buy it. So that was his idea. But one other person in Philadelphia, and this we know was Benjamin Rush, because he later revealed that he wrote this essay that was published under a pseudonym, as many things in this period were. He said, no, let's not do either of those. Let's just not let the tea land in the first place. Because he said, if the tea lands, people will want to buy it, and we will not be able to control the situation. So the destruction of the tea in Boston and later elsewhere, when other tea arrived, not directly from the East India Company, but consigned to specific merchants in different colonies, that was the most dramatic version of not letting the tea land. But there were also ways to do it without doing that. You could let the tea, you could stop the ship from entering the harbor. And that's what happened in both Philadelphia and New York. When the tea ships arrived in Philadelphia and New York, they simply would not allow the ship to officially enter the harbor. And so they turned the ships away. And so therefore the tea could not be landed, and the ships sailed back to England. Another option eventually developed, which was confiscation of the tea by authorities. And that's what happened in Charleston to the tea that was headed to Charleston in 1773. The customs officers in Charleston confiscated the tea and stored it in Charleston, wrote to England for advice about what to do with the tea. By the time anything happened, basically the war had started, and it was the tea in Charleston that survived was eventually sold for the benefit of the war effort. And also local people eventually took over the confiscating the tea. These are local committees. And that's what happened with the 7th tea ship. The cargo of the 7th tea ship, it shipwrecked on Cape Cod. And eventually that tea came into the hands of the local committees on Cape Cod. Now, of all of these methods, the one that remained the longest was the consumer boycott. But it's very hard to assess its actual impact, because we know from memoirs and other sources that many people continued to drink tea despite the fact they were told not to, for patriotic reasons. And some of them did so in secret. Some of them did so by claiming that they were drinking something else, but it turned out that they were actually drinking East India Company tea. Now, it's not just the tea that was sent in 1773 that was at issue, of course, because people had tea stored in their larders. Stores had a lot of tea on hand. There were big tea merchants in America, not just those who were receiving the consignees, who were receiving the tea from the East India Company. But as I've said, lots of that tea was smuggled, which was the reasons for the Tea Act in the first place. So some people said, why don't we just drink smuggled tea? It doesn't matter. And one of those, in fact, was John Adams. John Adams tells us in a letter that he wrote in July of 1774. He had been riding the circuit in Maine. He was tired. He'd been on horseback for 30 miles, and he came to Falmouth, Maine, and he asked the innkeeper, can I have a cup of tea that has been honestly smuggled? And the innkeeper said, no, I cannot serve you tea because tea has been forbidden to be served in town, but I can serve you coffee. And so Adams agreed to drink coffee, and he did so for several days. And he wrote to Abigail a few days later saying that he was now drinking coffee daily, telling the whole story and saying, I have borne it very well. So why didn't you drink tea if you were in a place that didn't forbid it? Well, people argued that you could not know the origins of the tea you drank, and so you had to stop drinking any of it. And there were indeed plenty of times in which I uncovered moments where evidence of people with East India Company tea trying to pass it off as smuggled tea so they could sell it more legitimately, shall we say. In addition, there are some amusing essays in the newspapers telling women they should not drink tea because it's bad for their health. It will make them give birth to sickly children. Some of the women who were avid revolutionaries said, this is ridiculous. Just make a political argument to us and we'll agree with you and not drink tea, but don't tell us something stupid like that tea suddenly is bad for us when we've all been drinking it for years. I always appreciated those women with their shall we say, forthright political arguments. Now, a second dispute that developed in 1774 was a dispute over paying for the tea that was destroyed in Boston in December 1773. The dispute started throughout the colonies immediately after the news of the Boston Tea Party spread. There were many different responses to the Tea Party. I might add here that the Tea Party wasn't called that until 1826. That was discovered by my colleague, Larry Glickman, here at Cornell, who's worked on consumer boycotts, the history of consumer boycotts in America. And he discovered that it was 1826 before the term Tea Party was used to refer to what happened in Boston. But in both Boston and elsewhere, before and after the colonies learned of the British response to the destruction of the tea in 1773, which was the Boston Port Act, closing the port of Boston from June the 1st until the tea was paid for. Throughout this entire period, there was a big debate about what to do about the tea and whether anybody should pay for the tea that was destroyed in Boston. Again, this is not something that we tend to read about in modern books about the coming of the revolution. We tend to think everybody out there said, hooray, Boston, what a good idea. And nobody ever thought about compensating the East India Company for the destroyed tea. This is not what happened, however, contemporaneously. Many lamented the destruction of the tea in Boston, including people you would not think did that. Benjamin Franklin, the founder of the American Philosophical Society, who was in London at the time representing Massachusetts. As soon as he found out about the destruction of the tea, he started writing to his friends in Boston saying, this was a really bad idea. You ought to reimburse the company for the destroyed tea. And he didn't change his mind about that until September of 1774. Until then, he kept writing saying, it really would be much better if you compensated the company for the destruction. George Washington also, when he first heard about the Boston Port Act, said that the cause of Boston is now the cause of America. That's a phrase that frequently gets published. What is usually not published is what he added parenthetically afterwards. He said, not that I approve the destruction of the tea. So he and others, including, for example, Henry Lawrence, who later became president of the First Continental Congress, or of the Second Continental Congress, Lawrence, who was also in London, much preferred what happened in Charleston to what happened to Boston. That is the confiscation of the tea by customs officers. Now, some areas and groups maintained a discreet silence. We have, interestingly enough, a record of the resolutions adopted in 28 Virginia counties over the summer of 1774. And they all expressed an opinion on the current disputes, but not about the destruction of the tea. Of those 28 counties, only one praised Boston, one criticized Boston, 3 said, we don't have enough information to decide, and all the others were silent. They did not discuss what the Bostonians had done to the tea, although they said they would support Boston in opposing the Port Act, that is, opposing the closing of the port. Now, so if people said that they thought that the company should be compensated, what kind of positions did they take? Did they all agree on how that should be done? Answer, no. Many thought the East India Company should even be compensated for the shipping costs of sending the tea to North America. That, of course, was lost when the tea was lost or returned to England. Thomas Wharton of Philadelphia, the merchant, who was one of the tea consignees in Philadelphia, actually thought that. He believed that that it was appropriate for Philadelphia to compensate the East India Company for the tea that had been, for the shipping cost of the tea that had been turned away from Philadelphia. But what about the cost of the tea that was destroyed in Boston? Well, Some people said, well, we should charge the perpetrators with it, but it was impossible to identify them. They maintained a secrecy and silence about their identity until 50 years later, when some of them finally came forward. And others, of course, came forward and claimed they had been part of the Tea Party destruction, even though they hadn't been. And that has been investigated by other historians, not by myself. That is, who was actually there or who had a good claim of being there. Some people said, well, it was done in Boston, and so Boston as a town should, in fact, compensate the East India Company. Officially, that is through taxation. Some people said, no, what about unofficially through Boston? Let's just take volunteers and contributions from wealthy people. And indeed, there were wealthy people in Boston who stepped forward and said, yes, we will help pay for the tea to be able to reopen the port. Some people said, no, let's have all of Massachusetts pay for the tea. Some people said, no, how about all the colonies chipping in? All the colonies should chip in to pay for the tea. In Philadelphia, John Dickinson, the famous Pennsylvania revolutionary, actually proposed using payment for the tea as a bargaining chip with the ministry to win repeal of acts that the Americans were not interested in. This was part of his proposed instructions to the Pennsylvania delegates to the First Continental Congress. In the end, those instructions were not adopted, but that he did so, I found really enlightening, because it showed how significant was the movement towards the belief that the East India Company should be compensated. This issue was not decided until October 1774, when the First Continental Congress voted not to compensate the East India Company. Unfortunately, we have no record whatsoever of the debate on this matter, none. We do know it lasted a day or most of a day, but that's all we know. We don't know what positions people took. We don't know how it was decided. So that's the second dispute I wanted to discuss. The third is the dispute over calling the Continental Congress in the first place. This was actually more easily resolved. When the Boston Port Act was adopted and closing the Port of Boston, as I've said, Boston wanted the colonies to join an immediate cessation of all commerce with Britain and the British West Indies, to use economic coercion to fight the Port Act. They thought that the American market was so important to British merchants that one way of pressuring the British government, where of course they had no direct representation, to change its policy, was to embark on a boycott of British products, imports into the colonies, and then the merchants, that would pressure the merchants, and then the merchants would pressure the members of Parliament. This really didn't work, but it was later also a key to the adoption of the Continental Association, which was of course, something that was adopted in important ways by the First Continental Congress. In fact, the only colony that strongly supported Boston's initial request for a formal boycott was Maryland. So in fact, calling the Continental Congress was the conservative, and I put that in quotation marks, alternative to an immediate boycott of British goods. And as we know, the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in early September, and as we know, in Carpenter's Hall, which was something of a controversy in itself, that Carpenter's Hall, rather than the Pennsylvania State House, was picked as a place to meet. But in any event, the pamphlets that were written before the Continental Congress met saw it as a conciliatory body, at least potentially so. Now, the Continental Congress did not meet those expectations, but that's really another story. And we can talk about that in questions if you want to. Now, I don't want to leave out the debates that took place in individual colonies. And so let me just tell you very briefly about one, my fourth example, that happened in South Carolina. The debate began at the South Carolina Provincial Congress in July of 1774, when after 2 days of debate, the members of the Provincial Congress voted that South Carolina would only be bound by resolutions their own delegates had approved, in effect, giving the South Carolina delegates a veto over everything approved at the Continental Congress. At the Congress, the South Carolina delegates then used that club to insist that there be a special exemption for the exportation of rice, which was the major crop of South Carolina, after the Continental Association's non-exportation agreement was to go into effect in September of 1775. So they wanted a special exemption for rice from the rules of non-exportation. The other Continental Congress delegates did not want to lose South Carolina, which was one of the most important and prosperous colonies, and so they agreed to this somewhat reluctantly, to put it mildly. And so when the Carolina delegates returned to Charleston, they probably expected plaudits because they had won this exemption for rice from the non-exportation agreement. But no, they were actually harshly criticized because other colonies excoriated South Carolinians as unwilling to sacrifice for the common good, as all other colonies had done. The delegates to the First Continental Congress into South Carolina barely avoided formal censure after 3 avid days of debate in the South Carolina Provincial Congress, which we know about because it was written about in the memoir of one of those delegates. Now, after the adjournment of the Continental Congress in late October 1774, as you know, almost exactly 246 years ago, the circumstances really spiraled out of British control. To repeat what I said earlier, by late 1774 and early 1775, the governor's letters to the ministry uniformly expressed their helplessness and their inability to control the residents of their colonies. Basically, what was happening was that Americans were voting with their feet. I don't know the way to put it. And they were obeying the rules of the Congress, the rules of the Allied committees, the decrees that were put out by the provincial congresses, and the actions of the local committees, which were locally elected by their by themselves or by their neighbors who were landholders. And then this was furthermore underscored by similar comments from ordinary Americans who wrote to their friends in Britain. And I will say that I found a lot of letters in this period from the cusp of December 74 to January 75, a number of letters written from the colonies to England, and the Americans uniformly said, there will be war unless you people change your policies really fast, because we are not going to change. We are determined to oppose what's going on. Now, I want to close tonight with one of the epigrams that I use in the book, which shows this, what had happened by the fall of 1774, by the time of the adjournment of the Continental Congress. In Dunlap's Pennsylvania Packet, an anonymous essay appeared in mid-November. I have no idea who wrote it, but I know it wasn't Tom Paine, because fortunately we know when he arrived in Philadelphia, and he didn't arrive until about 2 or 3 weeks after this essay appeared. This is what the essayist wrote in Dunlap's Pennsylvania Packet, quote, I almost wish to live to hear the triumphs of the Jubilee in the year 1874, to see the medals, pictures, fragments of writings, etc., that shall be displayed to revive the memory of the proceedings of the Congress in the year 1774. Now, that statement, and in fact the rest of the essay, implied independence. When I read it, of course, and I think anyone reading it today, it carries echoes of the centennial celebration of 1876. It was just 2 years too early. And that's, of course, how people at the time read it, too. It was actually very controversial. There were a number of essays that commented on it after it was published in both Philadelphia and New York. And the author never wrote a promised follow-up, or if he did not reveal his authorship of this essay. So if anybody listening to me has any idea who wrote this, I would be delighted to know what you think. But in any event, I will just end with that. And I will say it again, because I was so struck by this statement. I almost wish to live to hear the triumphs of the Jubilee in the year 1874, which for me cemented the importance of the year 1774.
Great. Thank you, Mary Grace. Mary Beth. That was a wonderful talk, and it's also a wonderful book. I had the great pleasure of getting an advanced copy of it and learned so much, and I encourage everybody, if they have the time to check out the website. We sent a link to it to purchase this book. It is an important story. It really hasn't been told in the way that you have told it, and in a convincing manner, especially as that epigram you just shared with us, I think proves your point. So I want to encourage everybody to ask questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. They're starting to come in fast. Before I turn to them, I do have one question. I figured I had the chair and I have my prerogative to ask you a question. And that's, the book really focuses so much on all of North America. It's not just about Boston, it's from Maine to Georgia. But I was wondering if you could expand your gaze even further. One of the other techniques you use in the book is something called advices from London, where you're talking about some dispatches coming from London to the colonies. So I was wondering if you could talk about what your sense of what's happening in London. If this is a year of revolution and unity happening in North America, what's it like for somebody living in London? And then even beyond that, what's happening in the Caribbean, also a part of North America with obviously British colonies, but also Spanish, French, and of course, Dutch interests as well, that all tie together to this. So I don't know if you could respond to both of those questions.
I don't know how to do that quickly, Patrick. But I will say that what I try to do in the Advices from London section is to give readers a sense of what people in London are telling people in North America about what's happening there. And in particular, I was looking at letters from Americans present in London and reporting to their relatives and friends in the colonies about what was going on. And so there are details there about specific policies and suggestions about how you might, deal with something that Lord Dartmouth is doing. I thought that one of the most interesting parts of that, frankly, was when I found and used Josiah Quincy's diary when he, who was a revolutionary in Boston, a member or an ally of the Boston Committee of Correspondence, went to London and met with Lord Dartmouth, met with Lord North, actually, had a long discussion with him about American affairs and wrote at great length about that in his diary. I just used excerpts from it. And I can say if people are interested in that, I'll plug the fact that the diary has been published by the Colonial Society of Massachusetts in the papers of Josiah Quincy Jr. And that's available actually on the website of the Colonial Society if anybody's interested in following what Josiah Quincy Jr. had to say about what was going on in London. As for the Caribbean, what the Americans were mostly concerned about, or what the British were mostly concerned about, was the use of the Caribbean islands as a way station for smuggling into the colonies. And as you mentioned, the Dutch colonies were particularly important because the Dutch, frankly, didn't care that stuff was being smuggled through the Dutch colonies into the mainland of North America. And this, one of my sections of advices actually comes not from London, but from The Hague, where the British ambassador to The Hague is going crazy over all the American ships that are in Amsterdam, not just loading tea and other contraband items, but also starting to load guns and ammunition. And this is in the fall of 1774. And that was one of the more fun things I found in the research for the book. And those are in the Foreign Office papers and the Colonial Office papers in London.
Great, thanks. We've now had a flood of questions come in. So the first one I want to turn to is Sally Haddon, who is a professor at Western Michigan University, a professor who wrote a great book on slave patrols in Virginia and the Carolinas. And she asks, I'm interested in hearing more about your views on the Continental Congress as a conciliatory body. Mm-hmm. So often we hear about the Olive Branch Petition and Dickinson's efforts to find some other path to independence. What other elements made the Congress appear conciliatory to the people at the time?
Well, one of the things that made the Congress appear, now this is before the Congress met, really, and a lot of the essays that were written about the Congress were along the lines of the men who are being elected to the Congress, and this was, of course, as the elections were happening over the course of the summer of 1774 in the various colonies, the men who are being elected to the Congress are really the leaders, are prominent leaders of the colonies, of their own colonies, and we should defer to their opinions. Part of it is very much an argument for deference. These men will choose the right path, and they should be the ones who are who are directing us. And so that's and there were many people who expressed that positive opinion about the possibilities of conciliation out of the Congress. What changed the minds of some people was when the Congress seemingly endorsed the Suffolk Resolves in mid-September, after the Congress had been meeting for about 2 weeks. The congressmen themselves didn't seem to see it that way. That is, they did not see themselves as endorsing a radical solution, but they were viewed by other people as having done that. And so some people said, oh, that's it. We know that this Continental Congress is now not going to be conciliatory. Also, I think one issue really was the secrecy rule of the First Continental Congress. No one knew what was going on there except for the delegates themselves, some of whom spoke openly at dinner parties, it appears, in Philadelphia, but mostly they kept it to themselves. There was a rule of secrecy and they weren't supposed to talk about it out of the Congress, and they tended not to do that. And so it was all a big mystery. I discovered many letters in which people wrote to friends in Philadelphia and said, please tell us what's going on. Have you heard anything? And then people in Philadelphia said, well, all I heard was a rumor and it may be wrong, so I'm not going to tell you what it is. So in fact, it was a big mystery to people, and all they could do was judge by the formal statements that the Congress made, including things like adopting a non-importation agreement, which they presented before the Continental Congress, so before the Continental Association. So the idea that it was to be a conciliatory body was actually reflected its origins. It was presented as a conciliatory body, and it was its origins, but in the event, it didn't turn out to be that.
Great. So our next question comes from one of the Society's own authors, Frank Hauser. Frank wrote a book on Nazi Germany, a series of letters that were exchanged between his parents. It's called Against Time, Letters from Nazi Germany. And that was this APS publication. And Frank's question is actually informed by the present day. And he asked about the moment of disunity that he feels that we're in right now, and wants to know what were some of the key factors that made it possible for the colonies to unite. And particularly, are there any lessons to be learned from this history while addressing our own disunity today?
I think that one of the lessons we can learn is the way in which people listen to each other. That's clearly what happened at the Continental Congress. Even though we don't know that much about what happened inside the event, the upshot was after the Congress, and we can see this actually in the collection of letters of delegates of the Continental Congress, that the participants got to know each other. There were many people, of course, didn't know each other before they were sent to Philadelphia to the Continental Congress. Many people hadn't been to Philadelphia. Many people didn't, the Bostonians didn't know the people from Virginia and so forth. And they formed new alliances, and they formed new, not really interest groups, but there are letters post the Congress where people from Maryland write to people from Massachusetts where they had never known each other before. And so they're now thinking along the lines of, yes, we agree about this or that, and we can think together going forward. So I guess I would say that the lesson for today is very much the need for people to listen to each other and to have a genuine dialogue about their political disagreements, which is what was going on in 1774.
Great. So I'm going to combine two questions into one. The first comes from an anonymous attendee, and they want to know how long you've been planning and thinking and working on this book. And related to that is a question from Michael Haddam, who's one of the founders of the Junto, which is a great blog put together by a group of early Americanists. You should check it out at earlyamericanist.org. And what Michael wants to know is, were there any preconceptions or previous understandings that you had that were changed by your work on this book?
Okay. Well, in fact, I have been thinking about this book since I wrote my dissertation. And in fact, I start the book with a quotation from my first book. and because it really follows up something that I intended this book to be my second book, actually. And then I got interested in women's history and went off for a long period doing women's and gender history. And in the beginning of my teaching career, I tried to peddle this topic to my graduate students, and nobody would do it. And so finally, after I felt I had come to the end of the agenda that I'd set for myself in terms of gender history in early America, I thought, well, nobody else has written this book, so I'm going to write it. And so I have. Now, I've been working on it very explicitly since, I started working on it actually just as I was finishing up Separated by Their Sex. And so that was in 2009. So I've been working on it for just over 10 years. This particular book. What did I learn that was different? I mean, I did know how important the year was, and I knew some of the stuff about what governors were saying by the end of the year. What I didn't really understand was, for example, how divided the populace of New York was, how divided the populace of Georgia was, how this manifested itself in the print dialogue. And I also didn't know that the word loyalist was invented in the year 1774 by a loyalist. And then when I saw that used for the first time, I realized that you don't have people who would call themselves loyalists until they perceive other people as being disloyal. And that was really crucial to me, that the perception of other people being disloyal to the empire made loyalist people start referring to themselves that way. Rather than as Tories or conservatives or something else, or supporters of the king, friends of government is the way they would call themselves before that.
Great, thanks. There are so many questions. I'm going to try and combine as many together as I can. So these next two, the first one comes from Cho Chen Feng, who really builds off your answer right there. And they want to know, you've examined this discourse and these differences so closely in this book. And as you just talked about, do you get any sense of were there any fundamental differences between loyalists and patriots that you can identify? And related to that, a question from Anna Layer is how, if at all, did religion factor into this discourse, these beliefs, and maybe even the divisions?
Well, I can certainly say that, let me start with the religion first. Religion was certainly an issue with Anglicans, because for them, the king was the head of their church as well as the head of state. And so Anglican ministers in particular ended up being loyalists in New England, and in New England in particular, not so much in the South, or not so much in Virginia, but definitely in South Carolina. I have one of the things I do in the book is I have examples of a South Carolina minister and a Connecticut minister, both Anglicans, both confronting major difficulties with their congregations at exactly the same time in middle of August of 1774, which is when things were really coming to a head at the end of the summer. Now I've forgotten the first part of the question. What was it?
It was,
what was fundamentally different? Yeah, what I think was fundamental, it was very interesting to me that many of the people who ended up being loyalists, that is, ended up opposing the revolution, also agreed that Americans should have the right to tax themselves. It did seem to be a general point of agreement that Parliament should not be taxing Americans, that there should be a right of representation for taxation. So that's not a fundamental disagreement. I mean, what is fundamentally the disagreement is there are people who are simply unable to abandon their loyalty to the king, which is deeply ingrained. Their loyalty as their identity as Anglo-Americans, as opposed to simply Americans. They couldn't make that break. I mean, for me, it certainly goes back to my dissertation. I felt then that there were people who saw those two identities as so fused that they could not be divided, whereas other colonists said, no, I can put one first, and the one I put first is American.
Great. So another combined question, and then I have one last question from an audience member. So these two questions are perfect. One comes from Al Cavalry, and he's asking about Canada, and he wants to know if the policies that the colonists opposed so strenuously affected Canada. and how Canadians might have reacted. The other's from Jeffrey Taylor, who takes us to the other end of the continent and wants to know why didn't Georgia follow the path of Florida? Why did it decide to join with the other colonies while Florida stayed out?
Well, Florida was not involved particularly. Georgia, in fact, did not send anybody to the First Continental Congress or to the Second Continental Congress, not officially. There was a couple of unofficial Georgians who turned up, but Georgia was deeply divided, very deeply divided, and it's so much so that they just didn't send anybody to the Continental Congress. As for Canada, Nova Scotia ended up as the place where a lot of the tea got sent. When the tea was turned away from American ports, some of it was sent to Nova Scotia. As far as the rest of Canada at the time was concerned, Quebec was such a new part of the British Empire that its involvement was highly problematic. Although the Americans, that is the people in the lower colonies, really wanted Quebec to be the 14th colony. And in fact, of course, that's one of the reasons why one of the first things the Americans did was to invade Canada. And actually, one of my graduate students has a forthcoming book about the topic of Canada and this period. It's her revision of her dissertation, which is exactly on this question. I will defer to her in a couple of years. She'll have the answer.
Great, thanks. So last question. We're just about out of time. And this one comes from David Kirakofe. And he's asking basically a counterfactual question. It's always a fun one, I think, to ask people. And that's if Parliament had backed off, hadn't passed the coercive acts, would Americans themselves have backed away from this movement? Would it have stalled the movement? And that gets to, I think, a larger question, which is, what is your view on the inevitability of something like the American Revolution?
Yeah, well, I think if Parliament had backed off, if they had in fact done what John Dickinson wanted them to do, which was to repeal the coercive acts, I think there could have been a long period of negotiation where there would not have been a resolution. Actually, John Adams predicted such a long period before he knew about the Port Act. He said, it's going to be like a pendulum. It's going to swing back and forth. We're going to have argument after argument after argument, and we're not going to have any resolution of it. The act that I came to believe was really crucial was not so much the Massachusetts Government Act, which changed the charter of Massachusetts. That was important to colonial officials, to elected legislators. But other people said, well, all it did was change the charter of Massachusetts so it resembled the charter of the other colonies. So it's really not so much. But what terrified people, including future loyalists, was what they called the Murder Act, which was the Administration of Justice Act. And that was the act that, in brief, would have moved something like the Boston Massacre trial to England. And the colonists uniformly said, when they made a comment on it, this is awful. This means we cannot be free in our homes from the British officials or military or whatever coming in and killing us. There will be no redress for us. Even people who were eventually loyalists, who chose the loyalist side, said about the Murder Act, as they called it, this is awful. And I think that really turned public opinion against the British more than almost anything else. And I will just say one more thing about that the very fact they called it the Murder Act, which I had never seen before, I started reading these documents myself, led me to believe how important it was. And the fact that eventual loyalist pamphlets, not one of them ever defended the Murder Act. Some of them defended the Massachusetts Government Act. Some of them defended the Boston Port Act, but none of them ever defended the Murder Act. And I think that silence tells us something about how much that act was hated and how it really turned public opinion against the British.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I wasn't really aware of that myself. So thank you for that question, David. And thank you all for attending. This was a wonderful talk. I want to encourage everybody to purchase Mary Beth's book. We sent a link in the chat function. It is a great book, and you'll learn a lot more than you just were able to hear in these 30 or 40 minutes that we just had with Mary Beth. So thank you again, Mary Beth, and I hope everybody will join me in a virtual round of applause.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you. Bye-bye.